Okay, everyone, welcome to our lesson on maps and geographic technology for Science 102. So our goals for this lesson are first to talk about the idea of earth science, since this is our first lesson in the earth science portion of the class, and understand why earth science is important and useful. Then we'll look at the functions of a map. We'll talk about how we locate places using latitude and longitude. We will learn how to read some of the major types of maps that are used by earth scientists and which we're going to be continuing to use throughout this course. And then we're going to look at the functions of GIS, Geographic Information Systems, which is another important tool that we're going to be using throughout this class. So to begin, let's talk about earth science. So earth science, which is also known as geoscience, from the Greek geo meaning earth, is the study of the physical processes that shape our earth. And that big umbrella of earth science contains a whole bunch of different specific subdisciplines that look at particular aspects of the earth. So you have geology, which is the study of rocks and landforms, like the solid pieces of the earth. We have paleontology, the study of life in the past of Earth that's preserved in the form of fossils and certain chemical signatures in rocks and so forth. And we can reconstruct the past of the Earth through paleontology. It includes hydrology, which is the study of water systems. It includes atmospheric science, which is made up of meteorology and climatology. So that is, as the name suggests, the study of the atmosphere, right? How does the atmosphere work? How do the different gases in the atmosphere affect our lives on the surface of the Earth? Then we've got environmental chemistry. So if we take our understanding of chemistry out of the laboratory setting and into the wider world and look at the chemical makeup of different aspects of our environment, how human activity can reshape that through pollution and so forth, that's our environmental chemistry. Earth science can include ecology, the study of organisms and how they form ecosystems, interacting with each other and interacting with the non-living parts of the environment, like soils and atmosphere and water and so forth. We've got cryology, which comes from a word meaning frozen. So cryology is the study of the frozen parts of our Earth. Ice, glaciers, snow, permafrost, a very important system that shapes life on our Earth. We've got fire science, which is my area of specialty. So understanding how things on Earth burn. If you've been paying attention to the news and seen the major wildfires that have been happening recently, that comes under that umbrella of fire science, to understand why those wildfires are happening, why they've gotten as catastrophic as they have, and what we can do about them. And then the last thing that I've got there is remote sensing. So the use of satellites and other platforms to gather data about the Earth that we then use in all these other subdisciplines comes under this umbrella of earth science. And so earth science in our class, we're going to be, sitting at a computer to learn about earth science, since this is an online class. But really the best way to understand the Earth is to get out and see it. So I hope as we go through this class, as you're learning things about the Earth, that you then think about those things as you go outside, as you see things in the landscape around you that are connected to the things we're learning about in this class, and that you can draw those connections to your direct experience of the Earth itself. Because, of course, as earth scientists, we go out into the field all the time. The photo you see there is from a few years ago when Dr. Burkhart from my department led a group of about 15 students to the Badlands of South Dakota and several other locations out west to study earth science. And you can see them there diligently taking notes about that bluff that Dr. Burkhart is pointing out important geological features of. In this class, we're going to be particularly concerned with how earth science helps us understand natural hazards. So you can see I've got some pictures there of some common natural hazards. We've got a volcanic eruption, we've got a flood, we've got a wildfire. So by focusing on these natural hazards, these are things that are potentially pretty relevant to your life, right? These are events that can jeopardize your life, your property, your community. And so in this class, we're going to be trying to understand what causes these hazards, right? Why do we have floods in certain areas? Why do we have wildfires or volcanic eruptions or whatever else? We're going to be looking at how do they affect people, right? What's the impact on human life of these different kinds of hazard events? And then what can we do about them? Right? If we don't want to have our property destroyed in a flood, how could we avoid that kind of a consequence? And in the last phase of this class, we're going to be giving some extended attention to the phenomenon of climate change, because climate change is often described as a threat multiplier. Climate change takes the natural hazards that we're already exposed to and amps them up, makes them more serious impacts on us and our society. So we want to have a clear understanding of the processes of climate change and how that relates to the various hazards that we might experience. So then the last point that I want to make about earth science in general is just the continued relevance of earth science to things that are happening around us all the time. If you take a look at current events on any given day, you'll see numerous connections to earth science, numerous stories that you can understand in more detail if you have a good grasp of earth science. So what I've got here is just a screenshot from Google News on the day that I recorded this video. So I didn't pick this day special for its earth science relevance. And we can look at the headlines here and see several headlines that have a clear earth science connection. So if we look under the US column there, first one is about Donald Trump being indicted, not really an earth science angle there, but number two is about the massive wildfires that were going on the island of Maui in Hawaii. And to understand those wildfires, right, to understand how that event happened, how it has affected the people of Hawaii, how it could be prevented in the future, we could turn to earth science. Earth science helps us understand, for example, the role of climate change in making wildfires like that more extreme. It helps us understand the wind patterns that drove those fires into areas where people were living. It helps us understand the ecological changes that were happening in Hawaii with, for example, the spread of invasive grasses that contributed to the severity of those fires. So there's a ton of earth science connections with the Maui wildfires. Then if we look under the world column, we've got several stories about the war in Ukraine. And so that's mostly a geopolitical question. But if you look at the third story there, it talks about a container ship that was able to defy the Russian blockade and leave from Ukraine, carrying, among other things, shipments of wheat that were grown in Ukraine. And so to understand the background of that story, to understand why is it so important whether or not Ukraine is able to ship wheat out through its ports, we can look at, well, why is Ukraine such an important location for growing wheat in the first place? And that comes down to earth science, to understand the climate of Ukraine, the soils that are available, the landforms that make large-scale wheat farming possible, and then to understand why Russia is able to blockade Ukraine and interfere with its shipping of wheat also is an earth science question, to understand the arrangement of land and water that shapes those shipping routes out of Ukraine. So our main topic in this lesson is maps. And as the title of this slide says, maps are our most important tool in the geosciences. We are going to be looking at a lot of maps over the course of this section of the course. I've got two examples there on the slide. We've got a geological map of Pennsylvania. So it's showing the different areas of the state on the basis of their landforms. And then the second one is a series of maps showing the results of a climate model, trying to predict how much climate change would happen under different sorts of circumstances. So we've got a bunch of different kinds of maps at different scales showing different kinds of things that we're going to be looking at over the course of this course. Because to study the Earth, we need to know where things are on the surface of our Earth. And so that where question means that we're going to be looking at what's called spatial data. So spatial data is data about where things are in geographical space, or their location on the Earth. So spatial coming from the word space, right? And space here meaning location on the Earth, not like outer space in the universe. So a map is a simplified representation of the Earth that's made for a specific purpose. So maps represent the Earth. They show us what's on the Earth, but they're always simplified. Maps are always taking the complicated, messy reality of the world and making it simpler. If you look at that geological map, right, the landforms in Pennsylvania aren't completely the same throughout each of those colored areas, and they don't suddenly change to something totally different when you cross that boundary. But we've simplified it. We've said we're going to take this area that has generally similar landforms, and we're going to call it a area, right? We're going to call it the Pittsburgh Low Plateau section, and color it in one color because that simplification helps us to see what's going on that map. Right? It helps us understand things if we can simplify them, group them into these kind of colored categories on that map. Likewise with the maps of climate change predictions, right? That scale has it kind of blocked into different color levels, makes it easier to look at that map and see what's going on, easier to refer back to the legend to see exactly what temperatures each color represents, etc. And in both cases, we're mapping just one thing. Right? There's no information about geology on those climate change maps. There's no information about climate on the geological map. So you can make a map of just about anything, but you can't make a map of everything at once. You've got to choose, what are you putting on your map? What aspect of the Earth are you trying to understand through making this map? And so that's another important simplification. You're leaving out a lot of what's going on in the world to focus on one thing that you want to explore through making this map. And now a map may be a static image. So the ones on the slide there, they're just a single image of the area that they're covering. But you could also have a map that's interactive, where you can zoom in and out on it, where you can change how things are represented, where you can add and subtract data, where you can run sorts of calculations to explore things that you find on the map. And that interactive aspect is what brings us to GIS, Geographic Information Systems. So these are computer programs that help us to analyze spatial data. So when we have that spatial data about where things are, we can use computer systems, which we call GIS, to help us explore and analyze that data in ways that we couldn't do with just a, static flat map that you might print out on a piece of paper. So in order to have spatial data, we need to be able to say where things are. And our most basic way of showing where things are on the Earth is latitude and longitude. We can give a set of coordinates that tell us where things are on the Earth. So the Earth is almost round. So the Earth is not quite a perfect sphere. It's closer to what we call an oblate spheroid. So it's like a sphere that's slightly flattened at the top and bottom and then slightly bulges around the middle. So the circumference of the Earth going around the equator is a little bit larger than the circumference going north to south through the poles. And that slight flattening at the poles and bulging at the equator is a result of the fact that the Earth is spinning on its axis. So we have this imaginary line going through the center of the Earth that's our axis, and we're spinning around that axis. And that axis then provides a reference point for us to determine locations on the rest of the Earth. We can locate ourselves with reference to the North and South Pole, where that axis intersects with the surface of the Earth. And so those coordinates take the form of latitude and longitude. So latitude tells you how close are you to one of the poles. And it's measured in degrees. So 0 degrees latitude is the equator, the midpoint between the poles. Then you have increasing number of degrees either north or south until you get to the poles. And the poles are 90 degrees north at the North Pole, 90 south at the South Pole. Okay, so your latitude will be a number of degrees either north or south from 0 to 90. At Slippery Rock, we are at about 42 degrees north latitude, so kind of halfway up the Earth. Longitude tells you how far you are east to west. Now, there's not any sort of natural reference point for this east to west. Because the Earth is spinning on its axis all the way around. So we've selected an arbitrary starting point that we call the prime meridian. It runs through the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, England, which is part of the London area. It was chosen because at the time that these decisions were made, England was the most powerful country in the world, and they could decide they wanted the 0 point to go through their Royal Observatory. And, we've continued to use that as the baseline just because it would be, too complicated to suddenly switch all of our latitudes and longitudes to some other baseline. So 0 degree longitude is the prime meridian, that line that runs from the North Pole to the South Pole going through the Greenwich Observatory. And then you measure east and west various numbers of degrees until you get to 180 degrees, which goes around the opposite side of the world, generally down through the Pacific Ocean. So that's 180 degrees on the opposite side, and everything in between is some number of degrees east or west, between 0 and 180. So at Slippery Rock, we're at about 80 degrees west longitude. So we're about 80 degrees west of that prime meridian through Greenwich, England. So once we have coordinates, we can use that system to gather spatial data. We can gather data about the world and link it to a spatial location, and then those spatial locations are all using the same coordinate system, the same way of placing them on the Earth, so that we can see what's going on and compare these different pieces of data. So one way you can gather data about the Earth is you can go out there. You can go to the places you're gathering data about, and you can take whatever measurements you might be doing, right? You can go out there and see what kind of rocks are here, or what's the temperature here, or how much rain has fallen here, whatever other field-based measurement you might be doing. And then you take that piece of data, right, that piece of information about, say, the temperature at that location, and you attach its location to it. And there are various ways to do that. One very common way that we would do that with data these days is using GPS, the Global Positioning System. So the GPS is based on a system of satellites that are orbiting our Earth. And a GPS receiver, and you've got one of those in your cell phone, can communicate with those satellites. Essentially, those satellites send out a message with a very exact timestamp. They send out a message saying it is exactly such and such time. By the time that message gets to your GPS receiver, it's no longer that time anymore, right? A little bit of time has elapsed. It takes a little bit of time for that signal to get from the satellite to your cell phone or your GPS receiver. And so that time lag tells us how far away you are from the satellite, because that signal travels at a known speed. So you can calculate your distance from that satellite. Once you get signals from several different satellites, so a minimum of 3 that's necessary to calculate a location in 3 dimensions, but the more satellites that you can calculate your distance from, the better, because you can average out errors and so forth. You use those distances from those satellites and our knowledge of the orbital patterns of those satellites, right? Exactly where above the Earth each satellite is at any given moment, to calculate where you are on the surface of the Earth. There'll be one point on Earth that's exactly the right distance from all those satellites at their times of being at certain points in their orbit when they sent out that time-stamped signal. So once you know your position using GPS, you can say then this piece of data, right, this temperature reading or whatever, was at this latitude, longitude coordinates. And you gather a whole bunch of those and you get a spatial data set. You get information across some larger area of whatever it is, temperature or whatever it is that you are gathering data about. The other main way that we get spatial data is through remote sensing. Remote sensing means we're measuring information using a sensor in some sort of a vehicle that is flying above the Earth and is looking down at the Earth. So rather than having to go places physically and be there in person, we can use some sort of vehicle flying above the Earth to gather certain kinds of data. And so that vehicle might be an aircraft, like an airplane or a helicopter. It could be a satellite. And in the picture there, you see a bunch of the different satellites that NASA currently operates. They are designed to gather different sorts of data. They have different orbital periods. They have different kinds of sensors on them, gathering different sorts of information. And then other countries also have their own satellites gathering other sorts of information. So we have satellite remote sensing. And then increasingly, we're using drones. So a vehicle without a human passenger that we can navigate around, carrying some sort of a sensor to gather information about whatever it is we're flying it over. And the sensors on a remote sensing platform can detect a variety of different kinds of data. So they can gather visible light data, essentially just a camera taking pictures of the Earth. They can gather infrared data or microwave data or radio wave data. So these are other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum that we can't see with our eyes, but which we can build a sensor that will detect that data. We can also have sonar-based sensors that use sound waves to gather data about the ground underneath. And the usefulness of these different kinds of data is going to depend on what we're trying to find out about the Earth. So let's now look at some of the ways that we can take this spatial data and make a map of it. Either we can look at this data and see what's going on, try to determine what kind of patterns there are, try to explain what's going on the Earth. So there's a number of different kinds of maps that we're going to encounter in this class that I want to talk just a little bit about how each of them works. So probably the simplest kind of map to look at is point data. So in a point data map, you've got individual observations that are each marked with some sort of a symbol on the map. So in this case, as an example, I've got a screenshot from the U.S. Geological Survey's website showing earthquakes. And this is a site that we'll be looking at later when we talk about earthquakes. So they've got a point on that map showing each earthquake that has been detected in the past day. And you can vary those symbols in size, shape, color, etc. to convey additional information. So in the case of this USGS website, you can see from the legend, the little key that's there on the right-hand side of the map, that the size of the circle indicates the magnitude of the earthquake. So a bigger circle is a bigger earthquake. On the day that I took this screenshot, there hadn't been any particularly big earthquakes. All those dots are that smallest size. But if we'd had a really big one, it would have been a bigger circle on the map. Then the color of the dot is its age. So how long ago was that earthquake detected? So you can separate out the really fresh earthquakes from the ones that happened a little bit ago, see if there's shifts in where earthquakes are happening over time using the color. And then they've also got the shape. Will tell you, is it an earthquake, which is a round symbol, and that's all we've got on the map at the moment. But if there were non-earthquake seismic events, so if there was something that triggered the seismometer, that caused some sort of shaking in the Earth that was not an earthquake, they would mark that with the diamond shape that you can see there. So point data, you're just taking each observation you have about the world and you're sticking a point on the map to show us where it is and show us information about that point. Another type of map that we'll encounter is called a Choropleth map. So a Choropleth map is one in which we take our area that we're mapping, we divide it up into area units. So depending on the map, these might be countries, states, zip codes, census tracts, or as you see in the example map on the slide, these are counties. So this is a county level Choropleth map. We could, make this map at the state level. We could make it at the, census tract level, whatever. I just happen to have chosen a county example for the slide. And then each area unit is colored based on its value for whatever data we're presenting. So the example that I've got here comes from the US Census, and this is showing persons per square mile, so population density. So population density is the data we're showing, and each county is being colored in a different color depending on how dense its population is. So the darker, bluer colors are more dense. So, if you look at Pennsylvania, you shouldn't be surprised. You can see more density in Allegheny County around Pittsburgh and in the counties surrounding Philadelphia, and then much less dense in the central and northern parts of the state, right? So the color of each county tells us its value in this particular data set, on this variable that we are mapping here. Another very important type of map is an isoline map. And we use an isoline map when we have data that varies gradually over space, right? Where two things that are close to each other are going to have similar values, but things that are farther apart might be farther apart in their values for the data that we are presenting. And so we often see isoline maps in contexts like temperature or elevation, or as we see in the example image here, this is a weather map from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the black lines on this map are isolines showing atmospheric pressure. So that's a very important variable to keep track of for the purposes of weather forecasting. And so we aren't able to measure atmospheric pressure everywhere in the country. We have weather stations at various spots, each giving their reading for atmospheric pressure there. But then because we know atmospheric pressure, it doesn't change suddenly, right? It shifts gradually in between places. We can summarize all of these observations by drawing these lines. So along each of these lines, every point that's exactly on that line will have exactly the same value for the variable that we're mapping. So on this map, you can see kind of in the middle of the country, you've got those three H's representing high pressure centers, and then you've got the sort of line that surrounds all of them. You'll see that the value of 1016 millibars is right on top of that line. So that tells you that that isoline is the 1016 millibar isoline. So any point that's exactly on that line has an atmospheric pressure of 1016 millibars. Then if you go to one side or the other of that line, you're going to go up or down. It's going to be higher or lower pressure. And we can see from the H's on the map that if you're going into the center of that blob, you're getting higher pressure. So that's greater than 1016 millibars as you go inward from that, and it's going to be less as you go out. And you can see if you look at the western side and go over towards Arizona, you'll see the next isoline there is labeled 1012. Okay, so along that line, atmospheric pressure is 1012 millibars. So anything that's in between those two lines is going to have a pressure somewhere between 1016 and 1012 millibars. So we can read an isoline map by looking at labels that are on the lines, or sometimes you'll see the areas in between the lines colored in. And then the legend of the map will tell you what each color refers to, right? What bracket of numbers each color refers to. It's the same kind of thing. It's just a different way to present the information. And then as the last bullet point there says, we often interpolate isoline maps from point data. So again, we don't have exact measurements of atmospheric pressure everywhere in the United States, but we've got a whole bunch of them, and we can infer what's likely going on in between those weather stations, because we know that atmospheric pressure doesn't change really suddenly over very short distances. So probably the most important kind of isoline map that we'll be looking at in this class is a topographic map. So this is a isoline map showing elevation, how high something is above sea level. So if you're able to read and interpret a topographic map, you can understand the shape of the surface of the Earth, right? Where do we have hills? Where do we have valleys, etc.? So it's really important that you be able to read a topographic map. So a topographic map is made up of contour lines. A contour line is an isoline that shows elevation. So just like the isolines on the previous screen were showing atmospheric pressure, these are isolines showing elevation. So every point along a contour line has the same elevation. If you were to go out and walk exactly along where a contour line is, you would not go uphill or downhill. You would stay at exactly the same elevation as you went around the landscape following that contour line exactly. If you're going uphill or downhill, then you are crossing over contour lines, right? You're going from one contour line to another as you're walking if you're going up or downhill. When we look at a contour map, the first thing we want to do is identify the contour interval. So that is the difference in elevation between two adjacent contour lines. So let me move my face out of the way here a little bit so that you can see the diagram here that's showing you how an actual landscape matches up with the contour lines that we might use to map it. So we've got this hill here, and you can see on the upper picture, the kind of 3D view, they've drawn these dotted lines. These dotted lines stay at the same elevation as they go around the hill. They're essentially what you would get if you were to slice through that hill exactly horizontal. Right? The edge of where you cut would be that contour line. Or another way to think about it would be is if this area was flooding and the water was rising evenly. A contour line is like where the shoreline would be if the water rise stopped at that point. Right? The same height all around that the water got to, that would be contour line. So a couple different ways to think about what contour lines are doing there. And you can see that, again, because elevation changes somewhat gradually over space, these contour lines form concentric rings, right? You've got the contour line for the top of the hill, then around that you've got the next one, then around that you've got the next one. And these contour lines are labeled with their elevation. So in this case, it might be a little hard to see if you're watching this just in the little YouTube thing there, but they've got these contour lines labeled. The lowest one is 100 feet, the next one's 150, the next one 200, the next one 250. So on this contour map, the contour interval is 50 feet. What that means is if you were to go from one contour line to the next, either uphill or downhill, you would have gone up or down 50 feet. Okay, so if you're on one contour line and comparing it to the neighboring one of those is 50 feet higher up in elevation than the other. Regardless of where they are horizontally from each other, one contour line is going to be 50 feet higher than the other on this map that has a contour interval of 50 feet. The other thing to keep in mind is that this map labeled every single contour line. But a lot of times you've got so many contour lines that they can't do that. They can't cram in all of those numbers to label every single line. So sometimes only certain contours will be labeled. They're usually made darker than the other ones. And we call those index contours. But you can figure out the contours in between by counting how many contour lines are in between each set of index contours, because the index contours are evenly spaced. So if you had an index contour that was 100 feet and another one that was 200 feet, means 100 feet in elevation difference between those contour intervals. And then if you had kind of 5 steps in between it, right? So 4 other contours that were not labeled in between those two index ones, you could take that 100 feet, divide it by 5, and say the interval between those in-between contours is 20 feet. So since contour lines are evenly spaced in elevation, we can use that to determine whether slopes are steep or gentle. So if you see contour lines that are very close together, what that means is that over a short distance horizontally, you're making a lot of difference vertically. Right? You're going up or down a lot over a short horizontal distance because you're crossing a lot of contour lines. So that indicates a very steep slope. If your contour lines are very spaced out, so you can go a significant distance horizontally without crossing very many contour lines, and therefore without going up or down very far, that's going to be a very gentle slope. And you can kind of see that on the diagram there. That hill is steeper towards the top and less steep towards the bottom. You can see that the contour lines are closer together near the top of the hill, and then they spread out as we get down towards the bottom of the hill on that diagram. Another tip when you're reading a contour map, if you're trying to just get your head around which areas are the hills that are going up and which areas the valleys going down, remember that water flows downhill. So if you see a stream or some other water body on that map, you know that everything to either side of that stream is going to be higher elevation than the stream, right? Because the water would flow downhill to the lowest point to form the stream or lake or whatever else. And as contour lines cross a stream, they make a V or U shape pointing upstream. So that stream is also sloped down as it flows towards its eventual destination, and so the contour lines are going to make kind of a U or V shape as they cross the stream. And that V or U is going to point upstream. So that can also help you determine, if you're not sure which direction the stream is flowing in, those V or U shapes, you can follow them to figure out which is uphill and which is downhill for the stream. Okay, so let's look at an example of a real topographic map so you can see how you might apply some of this to actually reading one of these maps. So this is an example of a very zoomed in piece of a topographic map produced by the United States Geological Survey, USGS. They produce really detailed, high quality topographic maps of everywhere in the entire country. You can go on their website and download them for free. And we'll be looking at a bunch of USGS topographic maps over the course of this course. So it's good to be able to read these to understand what's going on here. This one happens to be a spot in eastern Pennsylvania, not too far from where I went to high school. But, same principles apply regardless of where in the country the map is showing. So when we look at this map, first thing we'll notice is we've got the Lehigh River, big river flowing through the center. So we should already know that anything that's along that Lehigh River is probably going to be some of the lowest elevation spots on this map, right? Because the water's flowing downwards towards that big river. And so that means if we look at something like the little stream that's flowing through Niss Hollow, across the middle of the map there, we can pretty easily figure out that stream must be flowing eastward because it empties into the Lehigh River at the bottom, right? Small streams tend to flow into big streams, but if we didn't see that, if that map cut off around where Interstate 476 was so that we couldn't see where that stream was going, we could still figure out which was uphill and which was downhill for that stream and which direction was flowing by looking at the contour lines as they cross the stream. So you'll see as contour lines go across that Niss Hollow stream, they're making kind of a V shape. Right? They're going to one side and then back as they cross the stream. And those V's are pointing eastward. The V's as those contour lines cross are pointing eastward on the map, and so that indicates that east is uphill. This Niss Hollow stream is higher at the western side of the map and then is flowing downhill towards the eastern side of the map. It's a little harder to do that with the Lehigh River just because it's such a much bigger river. You can't see those V-shaped contour lines quite as easily on this little piece that I've zoomed in here. You can also see the same thing going on with that little unnamed stream just to the north of Niss Hollow. You can see again those V shapes that are pointing in this case kind of northwest so that we know that that stream flows downhill to the southeast. So this is a map that clearly shows those darker index contours. And we can see it really well if we look at where Dieters Hill Road is, and just north of that, between that and the Lehigh River, we can see several of those darker index contours, right? There's a 500 near the Lehigh River, that's 500 feet of elevation, then the next one is 600, the next one 700, the next one is 800. So we can say that the contour interval for the index contours is 100 feet. And so if you were to walk from a spot on one index contour to a spot on the next index contour, you would have gone up or down 100 feet. And we can, of course, tell from those numbers that the Lehigh River is at a low point. It's less than 500 feet elevation there at the top of our map. And then the top of Dieters Hill is going up from there because the numbers are going up. But if we want to figure out, well, what's the elevation of the very top of Dieters Hill, we can see that we've got our 800-foot contour line that's making kind of a little loop near the top of the hill there, just above the road label. But then we can see another little loop inside it. We've got another contour line there that indicates that the hill goes up a little even farther than 800 feet at the very top. But that line isn't labeled. So we need to know the contour interval between the smaller contours. And it might be a little hard to, pick them out there on that northern slope of Dieters Hill, but if we look kind of around to the side where they spread out a little more, we can count the number of contours in between. And we can see that there are 4 of those smaller contours in between any 2 of the index contours, which means there's 5 steps, right, to go from the index contour to a smaller one, to a smaller one, to a smaller one, to a smaller one, to the next index contour. There's 5 steps there. So we can take that 100 feet of difference between the index contours, divide it by 5, and so we can say the contour interval for those smaller contours is 20 feet. So if you go from an index contour to the next contour, the next small contour to one side of it, you've gone up or down 20 feet. So that means that that tiny little circle at the very top of Dieters Hill is another 20 feet higher. So that, if we were to label that contour, it would be 820 feet. And so the top of that hill is going to be over 820 feet, but it's not going to be quite 840, because if we got all the way up to 840, you would see another contour line there. We'd have to draw another one because we've gone a full contour interval. So the very top of that hill, just above where it says Dieters Hill Road, is somewhere above 820 feet, but less than 840 feet. That's the most exact we can be from this topographic map. That's, all the data that we have there. And so we can use that kind of logic to figure out the elevation of any other spot on the map. So if we were to go a little off to the west there, if you see where the intersection between Dieters Hill Road and Upper Niss Hollow Drive is, what's the elevation of that location? Well, we know that we're going downhill from the top of Dieters Hill, right? Because we're going towards that little stream in Niss Hollow. We've already located where the top of Dieters Hill is, so we know we got to go downhill for going any direction away from that. So we've got the 800-foot contour. We've got a unlabeled contour. Then we've got the intersection before the next labeled contour. Right? The intersection is in between the first and second labeled contours down from the 800-foot index contour. So we've got 800 feet, go down to the next one is going to be 780 feet, right? So 20-foot contour interval. Go down another to the next contour line, that's another 20 feet. So that next one is going to be 760. So we can say the intersection between Upper Niss Hollow Drive and Dieters Hill Road is somewhere between 760 and 780 feet in elevation. It's in between those two contour lines. So we've got that bracket of elevations that it could be. We don't know exactly its elevation. It's just somewhere in that 20-foot bracket because of which contour lines it falls in between. So we could do that all over this map, calculating the exact heights of various points based on what contour lines they're close to. Another thing we can do is we can see what areas are steep and which areas are less steep. So if we look at Dieters Hill again, if we look on the north slope of it, we see those contour lines are very close together, right? You can almost hardly tell them apart going down from the top of Dieters Hill to the Lehigh River. So that means over a very short distance horizontally, a very short distance on the map, we're crossing a lot of contours. We have a lot of elevation change. We're going from over 820 feet at the very top to looks like 460, 440 feet at the very bottom there where you get to the river. So, that's several hundred feet of elevation change over a very small horizontal distance. I didn't include the horizontal scale on the little piece that I grabbed here, so I'm not sure exactly how far horizontally that is, but those lines are packed very close together, so we know that Dieters Hill has a very steep northern slope. But the southern slope of it, going down towards that little Nis Hollow stream, those contour lines are spaced out a lot more. There's a lot more horizontal distance you cover to go down in elevation from the top of the hill or go up going towards the top of the hill. So the southern slope of Dieters Hill is much less steep. And we can apply that other places. If we look at that Nis Hollow stream and we want to say, is that stream steeper towards the upper portion of its course or towards the bottom where it gets to the river? You can look at how close are those contour lines together as they cross the stream. And we can see that in the eastern part of that stream, as it's getting close to the river, we got a lot of contour lines over a small horizontal distance. On the western side, we've got fewer contour lines over a horizontal distance. So that stream is fairly shallow sloped in the eastern part of this map, and then it gets steeper as it makes its final approach to the Lehigh River. So hopefully that helps you understand how to read a contour map, how to look at a map like this, identify where the hills and valleys are, identify what areas are steep or less steep sloped, and to figure out the exact elevations of particular places. So next, we're going to be talking about GIS, Geographic Information Systems. So a GIS, as I said, is a computer program that helps us to analyze spatial data. So each variable, each piece of spatial data that we have about a particular aspect of the Earth, so this might be temperature, land cover, population, etc., we call a layer. And so a GIS allows you to stack up these different data layers. So as you see in the diagram, there they've got an example where they've got one layer with the location of customers of some sort of business, one layer with locations of streets, one with land parcels, one with elevation, one with land usage, right? Each of those is a different variable, it's a different data set. And these make layers, and you can essentially stack them on top of each other to see how they line up. In the old days, before we had computers to do this, we used to actually print out maps on clear plastic sheets and literally stack them up as layers to do some of these kinds of analyses. Now we can do this all on a computer. It's much easier. So we can display that data, we can compare different data layers, we can update them as new data comes in, etc. And we can do this in a desktop application. So we might have a program like ArcGIS, QGIS, Idrisi, AirDOS, that can be a really high-powered system and do a lot of really fancy, complicated analyses. And if you were to take one of the GIS courses in the Geography, Geology, and the Environment department, you would get to use these desktop applications, see some of the kind of things that they can do. For this class, we're going to take advantage of web-based applications. So you can do a number of GIS functions in a website. Things like Google Maps, OpenStreetMap, ArcOnline. We have various systems that allow us to do a bunch of GIS functions just in your web browser without having to have a specialized program on your computer to do it. And for the purposes of an intro class like this, that's all we need. So let's look at some of the functions that we can use GIS for. And over the course of this class, we'll be looking at various GIS systems that allow us to use these different kinds of functions. You'll need to use these functions to answer questions in your lab assignments. So the simplest function that we have is interactivity. With a GIS, you can zoom in and out on things. You can turn certain data layers on or off. You can change how things are displayed, like change color schemes and so forth. So this is an example. This is a fire and smoke map from this summer. You may remember there was some pretty bad air quality from smoke from wildfires in Canada that was blowing down into the eastern United States. And so here you've got those gray areas that are showing smoke plumes, and then you've got all of those points are stations that are measuring air quality, and the colors of them are showing, the quality of the air. So the areas that are in green have better air, the areas in yellow have worse air, and then if they were to get up into red, or there's one or two oranges on there, but that's even worse air quality. So we can just make this map interactive. So rather than just looking at it just flat there, we can do things with it to look at all of the information, explore everything that we've got there. Another thing we can do with GIS is to look at overlaps and correlations between different data layers. So this example comes from an interactive map for looking at how the locations of pollution and of people intersect. So we've got two data layers. You can see the layer list displayed there. Right? We've got two data layers being shown for the Pittsburgh area. So we've got point data showing locations of hazardous waste sites. So every little triangle on that map is a site where hazardous waste is present. Then we've got a Choropleth map as a layer showing percentage of households with incomes above $200,000 a year. So this is essentially showing us wealth versus poverty, right? How rich people are in different areas of Pittsburgh. And so we can stack those two things together using GIS. And just from visually looking at this map, you might be able to see it looks like those hazardous waste sites are mostly in the poorer areas, right? That light green and yellow areas are the areas with the fewest people with high incomes, and you see most of those hazardous waste sites seem to be in those areas. And so we can just sort of visually look at that by using GIS to display this information. We can also use GIS to calculate the correlation, to do some actual math to see if our visual perception is accurate, right? 'Cause sometimes we look at things and we think we see a pattern, but it's not really there. We can use statistics to confirm that. And in this case, the statistics actually do confirm that hazardous waste sites are more likely to be found in poor neighborhoods than rich neighborhoods in the Pittsburgh area and nationwide. All right, so we can look at that relationship visually, and we can also use some math to confirm whether our perception is accurate. Another thing we can do with GIS is wayfinding. Find the best path from one location to another. So you've probably done this with something like Google Maps, getting driving directions. Here I decided just for fun to get walking directions from Avalon, where I live, to Slippery Rock. Looks like it would take me about 16 hours to walk to work, so I think I'm going to stick to driving. But this GIS is able to analyze the connections among all the roads and the speed that you can go on those roads and figure out the fastest way from one point to the next. You can also use GIS to optimize the locations for things. So this is an example from a study that was looking at the suitability of land in Australia for grazing. Grazing cattle and sheep and stuff is a big economic activity in Australia. They were trying to figure out where the best areas for grazing were. And so they knew that the quality of areas for grazing was dependent on a bunch of different features of the environment. Things like soil fertility, rainfall, etc. You can see all of those in this diagram here showing how they put together these different data layers and combine them to that biggest map, which is their conclusions about which are the optimal areas for grazing, right? Which are the areas that have the best grazing land in Australia. The best areas are in the kind of blue color. The worst ones are in red on that map. So they can combine these different pieces of information to find the optimum, right? Because you wouldn't want to graze your cattle in an area that had plenty of rainfall, but the soil was terrible, or vice versa, where the soil was great, but you had no rainfall. You want to combine all these different factors to determine the best locations. We can also use GIS to do modeling. We're going to be talking a bunch about modeling in the context of climate change, where we want to take what we know about how the Earth works and use it to project future climates. So here's an application of GIS on a slightly different problem. This is deforestation in the Amazon. So you've got three maps there. Map A is the baseline. So that was 1986, what areas had rainforests in them, what areas had other kinds of ecosystems. Then they use their model to project to 2030. And all the areas in red on map B are the areas that they predict will be deforested by 2030. And then map C puts the projection out to 2050. So they have an understanding of what the causes of deforestation are, and they use that to run this model to predict what might happen in the future, what areas are likely to get deforested. So GIS allows us to run these models using spatial data and to get outcomes that are spatial outcomes that tell us where things are going to happen. So that brings us to your lab assignment for this week. So the goals of your lab assignment will first to use latitude and longitude to identify locations, to get comfortable with latitude and longitude as a way of describing locations of things. Then second, you will practice reading some of those major types of maps that we looked at in this lesson, being able to interpret what's going on the map and correctly identify what the map is telling you. And then finally, you'll work with some basic GIS functions. You'll get to do some of the things that I was showing you in the last few slides that some of these web-based GIS platforms can do. So good luck with your lab assignment, and I will talk to you next week.